The Beatles' final concert was in 1966 at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. As the crowd screamed, their sound overwhelmed the arena, and for a moment, it was clear that the overwhelming noise wasn't just from fans, it was the collective weight of their success. For John, Paul, George, and Ringo, that night symbolized a paradox. Despite being the most famous musicians in the world, they couldn't hear themselves play. The fame that made them legends was becoming an inescapable cage. They were tired, disillusioned, and ready to call it quits, yet they had only scratched the surface of their potential. What followed was a decade of creativity, personal turmoil, and unprecedented impact on music. How did this band of working-class boys from Liverpool create a legacy that would resonate for decades? Was it pure coincidence or a product of their genius, determination, and timing? And what made them the greatest band of all time? Before the global phenomenon of Beatlemania, the Beatles were just four young men from Liverpool, a port city with a rich musical heritage. The foundation of their sound was built in the back alleys and smoky clubs of Hamburg, Germany, where they spent countless hours perfecting their craft. Here they learned the art of playing long sets, improvising, and working together as a unit. They played up to 8 hours a night, day after day, honing their skills and finding their unique sound. At this time, John Lennon, the band's frontman, was already establishing himself as a charismatic yet rebellious figure. Paul McCartney, with his melodic instinct, quickly became his primary songwriting partner. George Harrison, the quiet guitarist, was the technical backbone of the group, eventually adding his own unique voice through his spiritual pursuits and growing expertise on the guitar. Ringo Starr, the last to join, provided the steady rhythm and was vital in holding the band together during their chaotic rise to fame. The key to their success was their chemistry. Lennon's wit and biting sarcasm complemented McCartney's more optimistic and commercially driven songwriting style. Harrison's introspection and unique guitar skills brought something new to the table, while Starr's consistent drumming provided the anchor. But it wasn't just their sound, it was their timing. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the world was ripe for a cultural revolution, and the Beatles were in the perfect position to lead that charge. By the time they signed with EMI Records in 1962, the Beatles had already developed a style and camaraderie that would become their trademark. They were still learning, still growing, but they had something that most bands didn't: an identity. They were young, energetic, and eager to make their mark on the world. With Love Me Do, their first hit single, the Beatles launched their global career. What followed would change the course of music history forever. By 1963, the Beatles were no longer just a local sensation, they were a global phenomenon. What began as a small British pop band quickly exploded into an international craze. Their charming personalities, combined with their unique sound, made them impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just their music that captivated the world, it was their collective persona. The Beatles embodied a new kind of youth culture, one that rejected conformity and embraced freedom of expression. Beatlemania swept through Britain and soon reached America, where they made their iconic appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964. The scene was electric. Over 73 million people tuned in to watch, and for the first time, an entire generation of teenagers had a band they could call their own. This moment marked the beginning of their domination, and in the blink of an eye, the Beatles were everywhere, on TV, in magazines, and on the radio. They were the face of the swinging 60s, and their music became the soundtrack to an era of social change. But behind the scenes, the pressure was building. The Beatles were no longer just a band, they were cultural symbols, and the expectations were growing daily. The demands for tours, interviews, and recording sessions began to take a toll. Their personal lives were increasingly invaded by the press, and their every move was scrutinized. For all the fame and fortune, they were trapped in a machine that was slowly crushing them. Despite the chaos, the Beatles' music remained a source of unity and joy for millions. Songs like She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand became anthems for a generation. They captured the exuberance of youth and the excitement of a world on the cusp of massive change. Yet, as their popularity grew, so did their exhaustion. They were beginning to question the path they had chosen, even as they became the biggest band in the world. This was the moment when the Beatles realized they couldn't just be a pop band. They had to evolve. They were no longer interested in just churning out hits. They wanted to push boundaries, experiment, and create music that reflected the changing world around them. The era of Beatlemania had come to an end, but it was only the beginning of their creative revolution. The Beatles' transformation from a pop group to pioneers of rock and roll happened swiftly. By 1965, with the release of Rubber Soul, the Beatles had already begun to experiment with their sound, moving away from simple love songs to more introspective and complex themes. Rubber Soul marked the first time the band truly began to push the boundaries of what pop music could be. Songs like Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown, showcased George Harrison's interest in Indian music, while Lennon's Nowhere Man explored deeper philosophical themes. But it was with Revolver, 1966, that the Beatles truly began to rewrite the rulebook. Revolver was a bold, experimental record that incorporated elements of psychedelia, Indian music, and avant-garde techniques. The band was no longer confined to the traditional rock band format. The album's opening track, Taxman, featured a biting social commentary, while Eleanor Rigby showcased their ability to create hauntingly beautiful arrangements with the use of strings, setting them apart from other contemporary bands. The Beatles were now recording in a way no one had before. They embraced studio techniques that were groundbreaking at the time, such as tape manipulation, reverse recording, and innovative sound effects. This period saw the Beatles transform from a hit-making machine to a force of true musical innovation. Their use of the studio as an instrument in its own right was revolutionary, and it inspired countless artists to approach their own work with the same experimental spirit. However, even as they created their most ambitious music, cracks were starting to show within the band. The creative differences between John Lennon and Paul McCartney were becoming more apparent. Lennon's darker, introspective lyrics were beginning to contrast sharply with McCartney's more melodic and commercially accessible style. Despite this, Revolver was a testament to their ability to create together, each pulling from their own influences to create a sound that was uniquely theirs. The musical revolution they sparked with Revolver would set the stage for their next phase of creativity, the psychedelic era. But before they could fully immerse themselves in that world, they needed to deal with the personal tensions that were slowly pulling them apart. By 1967, the Beatles had fully embraced the psychedelic movement. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was not just an album, it was an event. It was a kaleidoscope of musical styles, themes, and influences, from Indian ragas to experimental sound collages. The album's ambitious nature was a direct reflection of the era it was created in. The 1960s were a time of cultural and political upheaval, and the Beatles reflected this in their music. Sgt. Pepper became the first album to win the Grammy for Album of the Year, and it marked a turning point in how music was perceived. No longer was an album just a collection of songs. It could now be a cohesive, experimental artistic statement. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and A Day in the Life became iconic tracks that showcased their ability to blend pop sensibilities with avant-garde experimentation. The album captured the optimism of the counterculture while also acknowledging its darker undertones. Yet, as Sgt. Pepper was being hailed as a masterpiece, the cracks in the band's unity were widening. While the album marked the peak of their creativity, it also signaled the beginning of their decline as a cohesive unit. John Lennon was becoming increasingly influenced by his relationship with Yoko Ono, and Paul McCartney, frustrated by the band's direction, began to take more control in the studio. George Harrison, meanwhile, was beginning to explore his own spiritual and musical pursuits, which further alienated him from the other members. By 1968, the tensions between the Beatles had reached a boiling point. The White Album was a double album that showcased the full range of their individual styles, from McCartney's whimsical Martha My Dear to Lennon's deeply personal Mother. However, the album also revealed the growing divide within the group. The band members were now creating music largely in isolation, with less collaboration than ever before. The White Album was a reflection of both their artistic brilliance and their personal struggles. Despite the fractures within the group, the album remains one of the most revered records in rock history. The Beatles had reached the pinnacle of musical achievement, but the end was inevitable. By the time the Beatles were recording their final studio albums, Abbey Road, 1969, and Let It Be, 1970, the band had grown increasingly fragmented. The early camaraderie that defined their sound was gone, replaced by individual pursuits, creative differences, and mounting personal tensions. John Lennon's relationship with Yoko Ono became a constant source of friction, with many members of the band feeling that she was intruding on their creative space. Meanwhile, Paul McCartney's perfectionist tendencies began to clash with the more laid-back attitudes of the other members. George Harrison, who had long been overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney, was now asserting himself as a formidable songwriter in his own right. His contributions to Abbey Road, Eat Like Something, and Here Comes the Sun showcased his growing talent and deepened spirituality. However, his desire to experiment and explore his own interests was often met with resistance from the others, especially John and Paul, who were reluctant to share the spotlight. Ringo Starr, often the most easygoing of the group, was also feeling the strain of the band's dysfunction. By the time Let It Be was being recorded, Ringo had briefly quit the band, frustrated by the constant infighting. The recording sessions for Let It Be were notoriously tense, with Phil Spector's production adding to the chaos. The final product, while featuring some of their most iconic tracks like Let It Be and Get Back, was marred by a sense of inevitability. The end was drawing near. Despite the personal turmoil, the Beatles were still capable of brilliance. Abbey Road, their final masterpiece, is a testament to their enduring chemistry even in the face of disintegration. The album's medley, which seamlessly blends multiple songs into one continuous piece, remains one of their most impressive artistic achievements. The Beatles were no longer the united force they once were, but their music had reached its apex. It was clear that the end was near, But before they parted ways, they still had one more masterpiece to give the world. As the Beatles entered the 1970s, their time in the studio became the focal point of their musical legacy. The creative explosion they had started with Revolver continued through their later works, particularly in Abbey Road, 1969, and Let It Be, 1970. These albums, while containing some of the band's finest music, also marked the culmination of years of emotional and creative tension. The studio, once a place of collaboration and joy, had become a battlefield. Despite this, the Beatles' ability to innovate in the studio remained unparalleled. In Abbey Road, the band's chemistry was still palpable despite their personal rifts. The album's final medley, essentially a seamless suite of songs, showcases the incredible cohesion that could still exist between them. It is a technical achievement in itself, with its intricate layering, eharmonies, and experimental studio techniques. The use of multi-track recording allowed for an extraordinary amount of control and manipulation over their sound, pushing the boundaries of what could be achieved in the studio. This period marked the zenith of their artistic output. Tracks like Come Together and Something are timeless, still regarded as some of the best rock music ever produced. However, despite the musical brilliance of Abbey Road, tensions had escalated to a breaking point. By this time, the Beatles were less of a cohesive band and more a collection of individuals working on separate projects. John Lennon's increasing involvement with Yoko Ono, combined with his growing dissatisfaction with the Beatles' direction, made it clear that the group could no longer function in the way it once had. Paul McCartney, feeling the strain, took on a greater leadership role in the band, further fueling the conflict. The disintegration of the Beatles reached its peak during the Let It Be sessions. Initially intended to be a return to their roots, with raw, live recording sessions, the project turned into a reflection of the band's fractured relationships. Tensions between the members reached their highest point, and the sessions were marked by arguments, confusion, and a sense of inevitability about the band's demise. Ultimately, it was not the recording process that marked the end of the Beatles, but rather the personal struggles that could no longer be ignored. Let It Be was released in 1970, just as McCartney officially announced his departure from the band. Ironically, Let It Be became the swan song of the Beatles, encapsulating both their artistic brilliance and personal breakdown. Despite the turbulence, the Beatles' time in the studio remains one of the most influential periods in the history of music. Their ability to reinvent not only their sound, but the very process of recording set the stage for countless artists who followed. By the time 1970 arrived, the Beatles were no longer a unified band. The same forces that had propelled them to the heights of fame, their intense individual personalities, their constant creative evolution, had also driven them apart. The stress of constant touring, the weight of being cultural icons, and the growing personal differences between John, Paul, George, and Ringo made it impossible for them to continue as a cohesive unit. The inevitable breakup was not just about creative differences. It was about their shifting identities, both as individuals and as a band. In 1970, Paul McCartney, frustrated by the constant infighting and the lack of creative direction, formally left the Beatles. His departure was a sign that the end was near, but it was also a moment of liberation for him. McCartney's decision to leave the band was, in many ways, the culmination of years of tension. He had been the one trying to hold things together, but with Lennon's increasing withdrawal and Harrison's growing dissatisfaction, McCartney found it impossible to continue. He had begun work on his own solo projects, and his departure marked the end of an era. Lennon's departure from the band had been a long time coming. Throughout the late 1960s, he had been increasingly influenced by his relationship with Yoko Ono, and his artistic direction had been moving away from the Beatles' more commercial style. Lennon's desire for independence and his frustration with the Beatles' creative constraints were well documented. His emotional departure was sealed with the recording of John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band in 1970, which signified his desire to break free from the Beatles' legacy and embark on a solo career. For Harrison, the breakup marked the realization of his own creative potential. After years of playing second fiddle to Lennon and McCartney, Harrison began to explore his own voice in the post-Beatles years. His solo career, particularly with albums like All Things Must Pass, 1970, showcased his growth as a songwriter and musician. Ringo Starr, the often overlooked member of the band, was also feeling the weight of the Beatles' breakup. Though his departure from the band was less publicized, Ringo too found his own path in the years after the split, with his solo projects and acting career. However, even he was unable to escape the shadow of the Beatles. The breakup of the Beatles was inevitable, but it was also painful. The band that had defined a generation was no longer together, and their dissolution marked the end of an era in popular music. Despite this, the Beatles' influence would continue to echo through the years, as their individual careers and their collective legacy would continue to shape the musical landscape for decades. Even after the Beatles broke up, their influence continued to grow. Though the band was no longer together, the music they created still resonated with millions. Their impact on rock music, pop culture, and society cannot be overstated. From their early days as a pop group to their later years as experimental artists, the Beatles' evolution mirrored the changes in the world around them. They were more than just a band. They were cultural icons who shaped the very fabric of the 1960s and beyond. The Beatles were pioneers, not just in music, but in how music was made. Their approach to recording, which emphasized experimentation and artistic freedom, revolutionized the music industry. They were the first to use the studio as an instrument, allowing them to create new sounds and push the boundaries of what music could be. Albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Revolver, and Abbey Road are considered masterpieces because they broke new ground and set the stage for future musical innovations. But it wasn't just their sound that made them so influential. It was their ability to reflect the spirit of the times. The Beatles' music was the soundtrack to the social and political upheaval of the 1960s. Their songs addressed everything from love and peace to politics and personal identity. They captured the hopes and frustrations of a generation, and their music became a vehicle for change. The Beatles also revolutionized the concept of the album as a cohesive work of art. Before them, most albums were collections of singles. After them, albums became statements, with each track contributing to an overarching theme or concept. This approach to making music transformed the music industry and influenced countless artists who followed. Their legacy also endures through their fans, who continue to celebrate their music and influence. Their songs are timeless, and their impact is felt in every corner of the music industry. The Beatles have inspired every genre of music, from rock and roll to hip hop, and their influence can still be seen in today's most innovative artists. New generations continue to discover their music, ensuring that their influence will never fade. What makes the Beatles the greatest band of all time is not just their music, but the way they changed the world. They were the voice of a generation, and their ability to transcend music and connect with people on a deeply personal level is what continues to set them apart. Their legacy is not just a testament to their artistic achievements, it's a reflection of the cultural shift they helped shape. Even now, decades after their breakup, the Beatles are still the greatest band of all time. The question of what makes them so remains at the heart of music discourse. Was it their innovative approach to music production? Their ability to capture the zeitgeist of the 1960s? Or was it the unique chemistry they shared, which, despite personal differences, allowed them to create timeless music? The Beatles were more than just a band. They were a cultural phenomenon, and their music reflected the spirit of their time. Their ability to evolve, both musically and personally, set them apart from other bands of their era. While bands like the Rolling Stones or Led Zeppelin were certainly influential, none matched the breadth of the Beatles' cultural impact. The Beatles weren't just a part of the 1960s, they were the 1960s. The true measure of their greatness lies in the fact that their music transcends time. Their songs are as relevant today as they were when they first released them. Whether it's the youthful optimism of Hey Jude or the haunting introspection of Yesterday, the Beatles' music continues to resonate with listeners across generations. Their influence is also felt in how the music industry functions today. The Beatles revolutionized the way albums were produced and distributed, transforming the music business into an industry that celebrated artistic vision over commercial interest. They proved that music could be a tool for social change, that it could be both personal and universal, and that it could evolve in ways no one had ever imagined. Ultimately, the Beatles remain the greatest band of all time because they did more than just create music. They changed the way we see the world. Their music has the power to evoke emotions, spark memories, and bring people together across cultures and time periods. They were and remain a beacon of creativity, ambition, and artistic integrity, setting the standard for all those who followed. Their story isn't just about the music they made, it's about the impact they had